this event here. I'm quite happy to be here today. My name is Gilbert Fridgen. I'm at the SMT at the University of Luxembourg since 1st of January of this year. Before I was still in Germany. There was a professor at the University of Bayreuth and also co-founder of the Fraunhofer Blockchain Laboratory. Roughly in 2016 it was when we started working on the topic. And in the meantime, we did a number of projects in the area and did a lot of interaction also with industry. So not only from a technical point of view, but also like from organization management or regulatory point of view. So today I'm going to talk about blockchain as a public infrastructure between sovereignty and regulation. Next slide, please. So if you think about the blockchain, if you remember blockchain, the first step of blockchain technology, probably you might remember Bitcoin. Bitcoin was long hyped as some technology that gives sovereignty back to the people. So it was the original idea by this not known Satoshi Nakamoto was not by coincidence at the same time as we had the financial crisis at the end of the last decade. So the idea of giving sovereignty about the money back to the people was an original idea of this technology. And then something happened. Next slide, please. Then something happened. So people started asking questions and they said, well, but there's also regulation. There's things that we need to care about. How does blockchain solve issues of GDPR, for example? If you upload into a blockchain an immutable data set of private data, how can you still be compliant with GDPR? But there's various other topics also of regulation that might play a role here. Just to mention two, it's AML, which is anti-money laundering, and CTF, counter-terrorism financing, which basically means as if you have a service to transfer money, you need somehow to make sure that none of this is going to be a problem. And that's not really so easy with such a public permissionless protocol like Bitcoin. And so now comes the question, what role does such a technology, such a blockchain actually play? So what's the idea? And how can this be adopted also by the public? And if you ask yourself this question, what you can do is you can think about what is infrastructure. Next slide, please. First of all, what you would think about when you think about infrastructure would be things like streets. So a street is kind of an infrastructure. Also, you would think about gas and water. And what we've developed in the past, let's say 30, 40 years is another kind of infrastructure. Next slide, please. It's the internet. So we have the TCP/IP protocol, and we have infrastructures like streets and the internet. And next slide, please. On these infrastructures, we have people meeting. And because people don't just want to meet, but because they also want to do business together, next slide, please, they need something more. And what you will usually find, I'm not really sure about the dates and the locations in Luxembourg, but what you will usually find in every little bit larger town is something like a farmer's market. So once a week, you will have on the spaces, basic infrastructure, you will have a farmer's market. If you look at the same in the internet, you also have marketplaces. Those marketplaces are called Amazon, eBay, Uber, Airbnb, Spotify, where you bring together vendors, be it here real vendors, producers, or be it musicians. If you look at Spotify, and you bring them together with the people who want to listen to the music. So we have in each case we have a basic infrastructure, And then we have a farmer's market, or we have these providers, and then we have people meeting there and doing business. So what's the difference between those two scenarios? Well, the difference is that usually we've not heard of any very large company that got extremely rich by doing farmers markets. But if you see those logos, you will find that those are some of the largest companies that you can see worldwide. And now, so the question is, what is the infrastructure that, for example, the public should care for and should provide? Farmers markets are usually organized somehow by public. It does not necessarily mean that they're run, but there's at least public investments also. And now you could say, well, shouldn't this service also be offered like by a public institution? And then, next slide, please. Then you would have something like, oh, sorry, first of all, this also generates problems. So here's just a news article, 20th of September, that very large platform providers, here it's a social media platform, obviously get into problems with the regulation. So regulation is not just bad, because regulation is basically something that protects individuals, that protects the society against market failures, so that markets and companies do things that they shouldn't do, like collecting high volumes of data and sending them to another country to be analyzed there. So if you now would say, okay, what could be a different approach? You would say, and now next slide, please. You would say, well, we can do the same. Why don't we just run infrastructures like this on the internet by public institutions? And at first, this might sound appealing. You would say, well, that's true. And there are people saying this. There are people actually, it's more to the left spectrum of the political, but they would say, well, Amazon basically should be run by, it should be a public service, it should be run by the government. The only problem that you have there is when you look into countries where you have a lot of interference of the government with actions like this, and especially in the digital world, is that this also gives a lot of data to governments. So all the questions that we are asking ourselves about giving data to those private companies, we then would give data to the governments. And I mean, so we have people working for the government here sitting also, and they would say, well, we wouldn't do anything with the data. You can trust us, and I know them both, and I would trust them with that. But it doesn't have to stay like this. If you look, for example, in a country like China, where the government is doing mass surveillance, you would always have the question, next slide please. So even the Romans already had the idea that if you give too much power to the government, it's in English, who watches the watchman. So who's careful that also in governments, there's nobody who would do anything wrong with this data. And if you look into some countries and into populist tendencies that we'll see in some countries, you might think, well, it's probably also not a good idea to give the power completely away to some government and to just let them run this infrastructure. Next slide, please. So there's the chance for blockchain, because blockchain can serve as a public infrastructure. It can provide platform services. So we've been doing research on using blockchain also in business context, not only in government context, but also in business context, that distributed ledgers can take the role of platforms. They can be the point, the layer above the basic infrastructure, TCP/IP, the layer that provides a trustful data, trustful basis for exchange and for doing business online. It's like a higher value infrastructure for people to meet there and do business that does not necessarily require to create a natural monopoly. So what you see here are natural monopolies, because I mean, it's natural monopoly for an economist always means, if you look at eBay, if I want to sell something, I'm going to go to the place where I find most buyers, and this is eBay. And if I want to buy something, I'm going to go for the place where I find most sellers, and this is eBay. So there's a tendency on the market for used products to go to one company, and this is a natural monopoly. But with blockchain, you could realize such monopolies, such natural monopolies. You could implement them as an infrastructure without giving anybody too much power about it. And this is basically the chance. Just a remark, I don't think that blockchain will really be able to attack eBay or Uber or Spotify or any of these, because I think, I mean, those are companies that are well established and they have a strategy, and it's always more difficult for some technology to really compete with this, at least in the short term. So I wouldn't give them a very bad chances to be able to handle that. But we can think about a plethora of other use cases where you could use such an infrastructure, and where you, for some reasons, but also for other reasons, you don't want to have a central party who runs this. Next slide, please. And what is especially important is that you can realize blockchain in a manner that is compliant with regulation. And most of the time, it only depends on talking to regulators and asking them, what do we need to be compliant with regulation and to interact. And I think this is also some chance that we have here, that here we have people who are creative and who are technical come together with people who have a knowledge on what can be done and what can't be done. And here's just one example of some architecture that we developed. It's vastly simplified, obviously. Some architecture that we developed together with the German Federal Office for Migration and Refugees on building a blockchain infrastructure that is compliant to the General Data Protection Regulation. So where public institutions in Germany can share data on individual asylum applications, they can share data on these applications without sharing all of it, without centralizing knowledge, which would be prohibited by the German Constitution, actually. So there is ways about doing this. Next slide, please. And what's most compelling is that actually blockchain is even a very good fit for structures like that. There has been theory in academia, a long time about platforms. And this theory basically says, well, it's always good to have an IT organization, an IT system, IT architecture that somehow replicates the architecture, the organization structure that you also see in the real world. And in a setting where you have centralized organization structures, it makes sense to have a centralized IT. But in a setting where you have decentralized organization structures, and here I see, for example, on a European level, also like all federal structures, where you would say, well, different countries have need to get along with each other, but there is no central organizer that can dictate basically everything onto these countries. And so as soon as you have decentralized organization structures like in the EU, but possibly also in the government, where you have different ministries with different responsibilities, it also makes sense to use decentralized IT infrastructures. So to think about not how you would centralize everything, although the organization structure is not centralized, but more how you can support the collaboration and the cross-organizational, cross-country here, maybe cross-organizational processes between these organizational entities. So coming to an end, next slide please. Coming to an end, I really hope that this will give you some ideas about what could be valuable use cases in the public sector. And so I'm really hoping that you'll have a lot of fun and that there's going to be a lot of inspiration here at this hackathon in looking into this topic of blockchain for the public administration. I'm quite interested in the outcomes. Yeah, have a fun and successful day.